Okay, so I think we can start. People are still signing in. We'll start. So everybody, welcome and thank you very much for being here. My name is Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP, and it's a special privilege to have an amazing group, an amazing panel of speakers, and thank you for joining us. Today's event is entitled Jewish and African American Relations in a Time of Rising Racism and Antisemitism. And this is a special event in honor of Black History Month in the United States. Today we have a panel of, an exemplary panel of colleagues and friends. We have Dr. Shari Rogers, who was really the inspiration of this event to begin with. As you'll hear from Shari when she speaks, she's the president of a nonprofit organization called Spill the Honey, and she's the director of the film entitled Shared Legacies, which everybody who's listening in has access to watch this very important and powerful film about the civil rights movement that Shari spent many years putting together. And the film will be available until Friday. So I really, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to watch it. We will have Natan Sharansky, the chair of ISGAP, will be joining us in about 10 or 15 minutes. He'll be speaking. We also have Professor Ansel Brown, who's a professor at the School of Law at North Carolina Central University. We have Professor Sunni Ali, who is an assistant professor of educational inquiry and curriculum studies at Northeastern Illinois University. We have Shari Frank, who's the former Southeast Area Director of the American Jewish Congress and a longtime engaged activist on issues of civil rights and human rights. And we have our friend and colleague, Dr. Reverend Carlton Long, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Lawrence Long and Company, which is an educational consulting company that tries to lift up mostly African American, but not only African American students from historically Black colleges in the United States, and helps them to get fellowships and a career in education, and helps to mentor and influence generations of young students. So for the panel, thank you very much for being here. It's wonderful to see you. Um, so I'm going to give some opening remarks, and I'll be brief because we have a large panel. We also have, by the way, Rabbi Hillel Lavri Israeli, who will ask the first question. He's a rabbi in Ontario in Canada, and he'll ask the first question. So Rabbi, thank you for being here. So I'll be brief. I think the work of ISGAP is, of course, dedicated to the study and mapping and decoding of contemporary anti-Semitism and other forms of racisms with an S, and particularly issues of racism against people of African origin, and certainly people in the United States, African Americans. And of course, this past year has been a tumultuous year, and we all witnessed we watched the deliberate murder of Mr. Floyd and the world watched. We live now in this internet age, and we watch this man's life being snuffed out in front of the world. And as horrific and barbaric as this criminal act was, tragically, it's also symbolic of structured and institutionalized police brutality, particularly against African Americans in the United States, their community. People felt and feel a sense of being under siege. I think that the past months have reawoken some of us who were asleep. I'm thinking of the words of Martin Luther King when he said we were sleeping through a revolution. And I think that the events of the last year has reawakened us, perhaps from a sleep, and that the levels of systemic racism, of segregation, of large swaths of people of color in the United States not having access to basic goods and services and employment and housing needs to alarm all of us, and to I hope through this event that if we can add a little bit of sanity to the conversation to reawaken us from our slumber. And I think many of us have been in a slumber. The film that Shari put together is, I think, vital and monumental. And I think it reminds people in the Jewish community of our struggle for human rights and for justice. This is deep within our culture and our heritage and our learning and our wisdom. And that the times that we live in today calls for all of us to go back to the best of our wisdom and our culture and our sense of justice, and to reinvigorate ourselves for a struggle for human rights and to end this barbaric form of brutality, of systemic racism in the United States. And we say this at a time when we know that racism is increasing, and as well as issues of anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism once again is on the rise in the United States. In the last few years, we've witnessed a rise of populism, of white nationalism, of extreme right-wing racism, the legitimization of things and ideas and discourse and individuals that were once on the far fringes, on the margins of our society in the United States, have somehow now entered into public discourse, into the mainstream. From the perspective of combating anti-Semitism, we're also concerned about the sort of the red-green alliance, the radical left, and political Islam. And I think this is an issue that Jewish students face on university campuses throughout the United States and throughout the Western world. As Natan Sharansky, who will be joining shortly, when he toured North American universities in Canada and the United States in 2003, he returned to Israel saying that the university has become the greatest threat to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, that this is a space of virulent forms of anti-Semitism, not just on the campus, but in the curriculum. So this is the context that this afternoon's panel will be addressing. But I also want to bring just a few personal reflections. I see Natan just signed in. Welcome, Natan. I'm originally from Montreal, and I was speaking with some friends. I was blessed, and I think my father is also here today. My parents really instilled in us an awareness of human rights and issues of racism. I grew up in a community and an extended family with survivors of the Holocaust. I remember in 1973, we had bumper stickers that Israel must live. I remember being in synagogue when the rabbi was told that Israel is under attack from all of its borders, and that the fate of Israel, just a short time after the Holocaust, its fate hung in the balance. So growing up with this sense of a community that's survived or was affected directly by the Holocaust, and in my lifetime, still struggling for survival and still dealing with issues of anti-Semitism, which seems to be reinvigorated throughout the world. I was active in Soviet Jewry. In 1984, I was the chairman of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and I met Natan's mother and brother in Moscow in a clandestine meeting with my friend Steven Singerman, struggling for the rights of Soviet Jews to be free to live as Jews, and knowing that if my family went east and survived the Holocaust rather than going west and survive the Holocaust, that the fate of the Soviet Jews would be my fate. And having that strong understanding that my freedom as a young kid growing up in middle-class Canada was narrowly different, dramatically different. And yet now, Natan, who's here with us, thank God, a free man living in Israel, Natan is now helping to struggle against anti-Semitism in North America. How things have changed so drastically in just a few decades is remarkable in and of itself. And sort of tying this personal history, I was also active in Ethiopian Jews and helping to bring Ethiopian Jews out of Sudan to Canada, and later they were free to go to Israel and to live as free Jewish people in our homeland. And I remember from these issues, from these activities and fighting for Soviet Jews and Ethiopian Jews, that I got more involved in the struggle for human rights. And I'll never forget, and I was telling you how my parents taught us about racism. My parents took us to inner city ghettos in the United States to show us what racism was. My parents took my sister and I to pick cotton in Georgia and to see tar paper houses, and explain the history of African Americans and the history of segregation. This is as a child. And I remember in 1984, the same time I went to see the refuseniks in the Soviet Union, I took a class on South Africa. And the professor spoke about the situation in apartheid South Africa. This was 1984. And I went up to him after class and I asked the professor, when did apartheid end? And he kind of smiled at my naivete. And he told me, no, apartheid still exists. And I said, I was shocked. And I said, when will it end? And in 1984, he said, I don't know if it will end. The system was still significantly entrenched. And to make a long story short, I became active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada and the United Kingdom. And I worked with the leadership of the ANC, and I was going into South Africa in the 1980s on behalf of the ANC. And then I went as an observer in the 1991 when the first party congresses of the unbanned parties were taking place. And I remember flying into South Africa and realizing and hearing German and Dutch announcements on the plane, and realizing that the same ideology that exterminated my people and my family was alive and well in apartheid South Africa. And that this racist ideology that defines Jews as being not white, and today apparently white, and not sorry that we mislabeled you in a racist way and welcome to the club. No, now today in the United States, there's memes going around that Jews are white and they are the white elitists and the worst of the whites. So to identify groups of people in such dehumanized ways continues. But I remember landing in South Africa and realizing that the system and the ideology that tried to exterminate my people were still subjugating millions and millions of people and dictating where they lived, where they went to school, who they married, where they worked, and the levels of their income. And this ideology tragically persists. And I'll just say on a positive note, the similarity, the commonalities that the African American and Jewish American communities have. And I know that Ansel will speak to it, and I believe Carlton will, and in Shari's film, it's profoundly and beautifully portrayed. But also growing up, I remember listening to Bob Marley. My parents went to Jamaica in the 1960s, and they brought all this music back to Montreal with Stars of David on it and songs about Zion and Exodus. And listening to that music and knowing that my heritage and my rabbis were teaching me similar lessons, and the empowerment that I got and millions of people received throughout the world from the story of Exodus and the music and the conscious music of reggae and Bob Marley, and the similarities that we have in celebrating Exodus. I know in the African American churches and certainly in Judaism, these messages are powerful. And going back to my experience with Ethiopian Jews and Soviet Jews, realizing that people are returning to our homeland and that we are living through a period of the Jewish nation being reestablished is also powerful. So there's all these similarities and connections as we continue. We've struggled, and tragically we continue to struggle. And I just hope through this wonderful panel and this group meeting that we will also deal with the racism in the Jewish community and the anti-Semitism in the African American community. And it's still prevalent. We know it's prevalent, and that the good and decent people in both communities will come together, and based on our commonalities and based on our common narratives, and our common needs to come together to struggle for basic respect, humanity, justice, and equality, that this will be a powerful part of our toolkit as we struggle onwards. So thank you. So the first speaker and the inspiration for this gathering, Shari Rogers. Shari is the president of Spill the Honey and the director of this wonderful film called Shared Legacies. Shari, the floor is yours.
First of all, I'm absolutely honored to be a part of this distinguished panel, commenting on the Spill the Honey's Foundation's documentary film Shared Legacies, chronicling the Black Jewish cooperation for civil rights. In the shadow of the Holocaust and menaced by the post-World War II Ku Klux Klan, African Americans and Jews learn mutual lessons from the Bible's Exodus narrative about oppressed people struggling for freedom yesterday and today. And I just want to say, personally, I have a personal close relationship with Dr. Small, so I'm just honored, and hearing him retell, this important personal story of his own and his own family just highlights the importance, I think, of hopefully what our film tells is personal stories and memories, all of them count. And I think these personal memories really spark the soul that's necessary to start building these bridges that are very important, especially during this time. And hopefully this Shared Legacies is not just a nostalgia trip down memory lane. It's a vital exploration of what the most successful intergroup alliance in American history between Blacks and Jews can teach us all about building new intergroup alliances involving broader coalitions of minorities, including Latinos, Americans, Asian Americans, and others. Coalition building between diverse minorities who disagree about some things but unite around shared goals may be even more important to the future of American democracy in the 21st century, as it was when Reverend King and Rabbi Heschel marched together in Selma in 1965. I just want to tell you a little bit about Spill the Honey and what inspired the foundation and then the film. Spill the Honey Foundation promotes partnership building within the Black and Jewish communities through educational and artistic programs, initiative, and coalitions. With rising racial tensions and rising anti-Semitism, Spill the Honey advocates the urgent need for these two communities to again unite in common purpose, as they did during the civil rights movement, to lessen prejudice, racism, and anti-Semitism. It began with the story of Eliezer Ayalon, a Yad Vashem Holocaust survivor who I met at Yad Vashem in Israel, who was given a cup of honey by his mother and blessed to have a sweet life. He suffered terribly and tragically from the war, with little time and energy to focus on anything else but survival. Yet he never forgot his mother's blessing to him. It wasn't until Eliezer courageously began speaking about his experiences that his healing began. But eventually he was convinced that it would be through public speaking, through sharing his story, that he would heal while helping others heal. And actually he was inspired to speak because of Elie Wiesel, who had a meeting in 1981 to call all Holocaust survivors to say that it was beshert that they survived, it was meant to be, and they had to be a witness to tell their stories. That cup of honey was the sweetness that always lived within him to connect him to others. A generation afterwards, the Black-Jewish partnership during the civil rights era is an example of where two communities spilled the honey. With rising racial tensions and rising anti-Semitism, it's more important than ever to build a connection and a conversation between peoples who have a shared memory, so they together can spread tolerance and compassion with one another. Our documentary film, Shared Legacies, focuses on that alliance between African Americans and Jewish Americans during the civil rights movement, demonstrating how even today there is a strength and healing in supporting each other. It was a lecture at Charles Wright Museum in Detroit given by Reverend King's lawyer, Dr. Clarence B. Jones. He was speaking about his book, What Would Martin Say? One of the chapters was on anti-Semitism. He promised Dr. King if there was a rise in anti-Semitism that he would be the one to step up and battle it. He took special note of the Jewish people and their commitment to Reverend King and the civil rights cause. Meeting Dr. Jones reinforced me reinforced for me the power of making connections with your own history and its influence on the present. I recognize the value for Jews and Blacks to get to know their shared American histories better by producing this film on the Black and Jewish coalition building. And Shari Frank, who you'll be hearing from shortly, I met her in Atlanta because she was one of the leaders with Congressman Lewis in 1982 that she will tell you about, where she revitalized this very important coalition. And she had organized an amazing retreat on Black-Jewish relations where folks got to really know each other. And she was then opened her arm and introduced me to all these important civil rights leaders that you see in the film. And some of them terribly have now passed, like Congressman John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian. But the time is now to reignite the power in Black-Jewish coalitions, to again work together, inspired by their shared history battling injustice. In the past 5 years, the rates of anti-Semitism have gone up and up. We see the racial tension going up and up. One cannot help but look at the shared destiny and shared memory of the Black and Jewish experience. One can't help but look back and realize that that alliance is badly once needed again. We need one another more than ever before. There is a moral responsibility to act today. Part of that is recognizing Reverend King's lessons in how we use words to uplift and to confer dignity on one another. While Black people suffered horrific prejudices, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. changed society through courageous acts and the power of his eloquence and speech. He chose words to spread sweetness that stuck to the hearts and souls of all who heard him, and who continue to hear his message to this day. And just like Eliezer had to make a choice whether to focus on his own suffering or to find blessings, so too, this was the message from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, "Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Dignity is often conferred or taken through the power of words. That might be why the Hebrew word for speak is daver, and the word for be is devara. And it's because words can be as sweet as honey or as painful as a sting. It's appropriate for our foundation called Spill the Honey. We must know that this isn't merely about history, something taught and learned in the books or school. This is our shared memory, a shared responsibility to remember. History lessons don't necessarily give us an obligation to remember and act. That's why when we talk about the Holocaust, they say we must remember or never forget. We don't frame it in terms of learn from history. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, means the hand and a name. If I ever forget my hand and my name, then everything falls apart. Again, this is all about memory. Step up and be proactive. Everybody should stand up and be counted, much like the 250,000 people who stood and were counted at Reverend King's speech in the National Mall. It was the power of the individual together with the power of people uniting. And the last thing I just want to say is that in the movie, I hope what strikes you is that Black women and Black men in the 60s had to hold up a sign. What did the sign say? I am a man. Can you imagine that in the 60s that people in America had to hold up a sign, I am a man? Think about that. So why is that? Then we can take this to today, that Black lives matter. As Jewish people, we know how important it is to focus on the singular. We care, that we value Black lives. And, as a mother, I have 3 sons. I've never once told them, when you see a police officer, you're going to have to worry about that they're not there to protect you. Like a Black mother or father has to tell their son when they're out in a car when they see a police officer. So like Dr. Small said, we have to think about all this in terms of, as we're moving forward, unpacking this important discussion on racism and anti-Semitism. And I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shari. Thank you for all your amazing work. Thank you. So the next speaker is Natan Sharansky. Natan is the chair of ISGAP, it's a great honor for our team that he is. Natan has dedicated his life to issues of human rights and the Jewish people. He was a symbol of the dissident movement in the Soviet Union and fought for the freedom of the Jewish people and their right to live as Jews and to leave the Soviet Union. He spent 9 years in a Soviet prison because of his political activities. Upon his release, he moved to Israel and became a leader in Israel and perhaps a leader for the Jewish people throughout the world. Natan worked for 9 years in Israeli politics and held several key positions in government. He then became the head of the Jewish Agency for 9 years, and now he's working with ISGAP and other organizations, continuing his efforts to promote human rights and the dignity of the Jewish people. He's published many books and articles. He's received many medals and accolades from all over the world, including the Congressional Medal of Freedom in the United States. So Natan, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you, Shari Rogers, for this incredible film, which I saw only yesterday. And that changed the topic of my speech. Instead of academical speech, in your film, I saw this picture, which you see just now on the screen. It's mistakenly said that it was meeting in Russia. Meeting was in Michigan, in Detroit, with the famous, outstanding Diamond Keys judge, that at that moment judge in the Federal Court of Appeals. But our previous meeting, a few months before my arrest in 1976, in the end of 1976, was in Moscow. And it's there in Moscow that the judge got my cap because he liked it and he promised to give it me back when soon, hopefully in a few months, I'll be in the freedom. Well, then I went for 9 years in prison. Then we met in America, and that's when I was pleasantly surprised that he keeps the cap, the pictures, and memories about a meeting. So this is that meeting in Moscow. That's what I want to start speaking because it's very meaningful. You have to understand, we Soviet Jewry activists and dissidents of the Soviet Union, after all, it was a very small group of people, and we could never survive. We simply will be killed before we even say a word, facing this awful totalitarian regime which killed millions and millions of its own citizens to control 200 million people in the Soviet Union. We could not survive if it wasn't the struggle of all the Jewish people and many of our allies from all over the world from the very first day. And what Jewish organizations were doing, they were sending all the time tourists, but these tourists could be very well prepared tourists to bring us information, to take from us information, and then to organize the struggle in the world. And so in the end of 1976, few months before my arrest, of course I didn't know that, but it was fast, the pressure was big, and I am an official spokesman of our movement and of human rights movement, of Helsinki group, which was organized this time. And so I almost every day I'm meeting some people who are coming from the West, organizing for them in meetings in our community. And one day, two people are coming. The lawyer Jack Greenberg and Judge Diamond Keys. Both are connected to the world of struggle for human rights and specifically to the struggle of Martin Luther King. So Jack Greenberg was then the chairman of the director of Legal Defense and Education Fund of NAACP. And he was the lawyer in the famous Brown-Weiss's Board of Education trial. And then in 1962, Meredith versus Fair trial. These two trials were like the big, very meaningful in all the struggle against school segregation. And in 1963, he was the lawyer defender of Martin Luther King when he was in Birmingham in prison. You remember his famous letters from Birmingham prison. So he was full of the stories, really full of the stories. And for us there in the Soviet Union, in the middle of this struggle against KGB, to hear about Rosa Parks and about how the young Jewish students from all over America were coming to participate in this desegregation of the buses, and how the 3 young Americans, 2 of them Jewish, were killed because they came there to help, I think, to register for elections. And of course, about the big support of many rabbis of the Martin Luther King struggle, and how the Center of Reformed Movement in Washington became the headquarters of the March in Washington, and how many rabbis, Reformed conservative, but also some Orthodox rabbis from New York and from Washington were part of the struggle, this march. And that made many things clear, why so many Jews who were coming to us as tourists, but in fact to continue the struggle, they were telling us that they go straight from human rights struggle in support of the rights of the Black people, they go straight to this struggle. So it was really helping to feel this connection. And I got to say that the Judge Diamond Keys, who at that moment he was judge in Michigan, only a few months after this, but he'll be already in prison. President Carter will appoint him as the judge in federal courts of appeals, where he'll be all the rest of his life. But they were the same age, about 50 years old, with Jack Greenberg, but he looked much more younger. He was like an activist. He lacked action. He was asking me about demonstration. He said, is there a chance that in those 3 days that there will be some demonstration that he wants to be about? So I had to explain to him that demonstrations are prepared for months and months. There are maximum 10 people are participating. Why? Because the more people know about these demonstrations, the more chance that KGB will arrest us before. And to organize demonstrations, the KGB doesn't know, but at least one journalist knows, and that can be published to the world. It's a work of many, many months. And then anyway, now then he looked at my tales. And those months, in fact, the last year before my arrest, I was accompanied by 2, 3, 4 KGB men all the time because of my activity as a spokesman of our movement. And I was telling him many jokes, how I forced them to pay in taxi, half price and so on. And he looked like jealous. And then at one moment we are in the elevator together. I'm taking him to one of the offices, and 2 KGB men push themselves also to the elevator. And he looks at them and then he says, oh my God, you must have very big balls. I was shocked when he said it, because, you know, especially the hypocritical Soviet Union, they are using off the record 4-letter words all the time. But in official language, in the public language, you are never using such words. So then I remember this cowboys films about sheriffs. I said, are you by chance a sheriff? He just laughed. He said, I'm a judge. And then, so he was a real activist, but at the same time, he came as a judge who at this moment is involved in judging the behavior of Soviet Union, the Helsinki Agreement. And I'm a founding member of the Helsinki Group, which is monitoring Soviet behavior. And he gave us advice. He gave us, so he said, you're speaking a lot, that you all refused it, meaning that you were refused in your right to immigrate for the Soviet Union. But you know, the very fact that they refused, it's not yet the violation. But the fact that they refused to tell you what are the reasons, that you're told secrecy, but you have no secrets, and they cannot show any paper that you signed anything. Or they say, because family is against, but you're 30 years old and your father is 50 years old and your father is making more money. All these have to have reasons. And he said, you have to fight against secrecy. And that's where we, the Free World, can very easily support you. I remember many years after this, because in 2001, Judge Diamond Keys became famous when he was dealing with the fact of how it was called like not repatriation, how it's called, when there were some people who were exiled from America in secrecy after 9/11. And he was saying that deportation. So, and he was saying that he wrote in his decision that democracy dies behind the closed doors. We, America, cannot afford to make these deportations in secrecy. By the way, his opinion was minority, but it became very famous. And then I thought, my God, that's exactly, he was telling us, the fact that they're refusing you in secrecy. And we in the West can make a case from this because it's clear that there is no democracy, there is nothing to die. But that's something that the West can be mobilized to fight. And well, why I met him in America in 1987, I was traveling all over 32 communities in America to call people to march on Washington when Soviet leader Gorbachev comes. And there was a lot of suspicion, skepticism, how Jews will not come. Some leaders were saying to Washington in January or in December, it was in big numbers. And I was speaking about 400,000 Soviet Jews who are waiting, so 400,000 Jews should come. It's interesting, when I traveled all over America, practically everywhere, in every synagogue, in every institution that I was speaking, people were speaking about March on Washington or Martin Luther King, and if we could come there, why we cannot come today? And when the march really happened, one of the biggest, that was a huge march, 250,000 Jews came to say to Gorbachev, let our people go. And that was like the last battle which brought to the bringing down of the Iron Curtain. It's interesting, for me, the biggest compliment was that it was told that that is the biggest number of people demonstration in Washington. The only one demonstration which had 250,000 people was Martin Luther King demonstration. So it was really like closing the huge circle. And then I have to say a few words about today. And for this, I want to take you back to Moscow. I took Judge Diamond Keys and Jack Greenberg, lawyer Jack Greenberg, to Andrei Sakharov. Andrei Sakharov was #1 scientist in the Soviet Union, and then he turned into #1 dissident. And he was speaking very powerful. And Soviet authorities condemned him, and then he was exiled. At that moment, it was just soon after he received Nobel Prize for Peace. He didn't go to receive it because he knew that Soviets will not let him back. And he was like the center of dissident activity in Soviet Union. And it was very rare that I'll take somebody to him, but that was the case, which I felt it's very important. And it's interesting. So Andrei Sakharov was speaking about, and his wife, Lena Bonner, was speaking about the prisoners, different prisoners, the political prisoners of the Soviet Union, Armenian, Lithuanians, and Christians, and Jews, and Muslims, that we, Helsinki group, were dealing with them. And they were telling their stories. In some moment, Lena Bonner, the wife, the very dynamic, energetic wife of Andrei Sakharov, she said, but it's so surprising and it's so different. You are the judge, you are the one who is fighting for human rights, and you are the judge, and you are the leading lawyer. Do you know that in Soviet Union dissidents, judge cannot be the one who doesn't repeat word and word what the state says. The lawyer who agrees to defend dissident and will defend dissident not representing the country will be deprived of his right to defend. So you must be so lucky. And that is not, like I said, that's exactly why we all appeal to America, because in Soviet Union, this communist revolution declared that all the bourgeois, that all the human rights and liberals, all these are products of the bourgeois exploitation of the proletariat. It was already removed. You don't need the judge who is not representing the proletariat. And so the hymnon was, we destroy all the old world, and then we build our new world without all these human rights and other problems. And here in America, you're so lucky that you can fight for these rights. And that exactly takes me to today's point. Martin Luther King, in his famous speech in Washington, said that our dreams are rooted into American dreams. And that was so for him, it was so clear that he is between monuments of Washington and Lincoln, there, and he is speaking that we are fighting for real American dream. Even at that moment, somebody will say to him, but those who will be your followers will demand to remove Washington and Lincoln. What he will say, he will be very surprised. So when I'm speaking, I really want to do it in a few seconds. I don't want now to go to the big problems which we have with some activists like Black Lives Matter. Is such an important organization. It expresses the absolutely justified anger about acts of police. And so many Jews, overwhelming majority of American Jews, joined this demonstration. But the fact that on these demonstrations are proclaimed some of the awful blood libels of today, like that it is the Israeli police which is training training how to deal with the demonstrators, or that Israel is vaccinating Jews and not Arabs. You know, everybody who spent 5 minutes in Israel will know what a big campaign everybody is doing in order everybody can be vaccinated. The more they want, Prime Minister personally went to Arab cities to say to do it immediately. But the real problem is not this. The real problem is, you know, just a few months ago, there was published the so-called ethnic studies model curriculum for California. And many Jewish organizations upset that Jews suddenly are not among those who were persecuted because it was between whites and whites. My real problem is not this. The fact that the hero of the film of Shari Rogers, Clarence Jones, one of the closest people of Martin Luther King, right, and he is now the chair in San Francisco University. He's writing to the governor of California how it can be that Martin Luther King is canceled, that the history of the struggle of human rights of Martin Luther King is not part of this curriculum. And there is explanation. This letter really mentioned, they're explaining that romanticizing the civil rights movement is a particular concern when it comes to what students have already learned. Prevailing narratives praise respectable, in quoting mark, seemingly passive, docile, non-violent Black leaders as heroes, while condemning loud and more militant tactics such as those shared with the Black Panthers Party. So Black Panthers Party is part of the curriculum as the predecessor of today's anger of Black people, and Martin Luther King is not. And that is the problem, that because real cooperation between Jews and Black Americans for human rights is based on the fact that we believe in the dream of the Bible. We are just coming to the dream of the Bible, let our people go. And we believe in American dream of human rights for everybody. And only based on the believing in these dreams and using these powerful institutions as Jack Greenberg and Judge Keith were using in our fight, we can win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natan. Thank you. So we're going to go through the panel, and if we can have the speaker speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, I hope we can have a bit of Q&A as well. So the next speaker is a friend and colleague, Professor Ansel Brown. He's at North Carolina Central University. He's at the School of Law. Ansel teaches on our Summer Institute, among many of the other things that he does. He works on legal research and analysis and issues of critical thinking. His research focuses on international law and Pan-Africanism. And previously, Professor Brown served as the NCCU pre-law advisor and director of the University Honors Program. So Ansel, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Dr. Asher Small, for hosting this important panel and discussion. And thank you, Mr. Sharansky, for your words. Your personal story of the inspiration that Russian Jewry drew from the civil rights movement is indeed priceless. And it's such an honor and privilege to follow behind such a wonderful human being and champion of human rights the world over. And reflecting upon this important documentary, Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance, it is apparent that there is a deep tradition and legacy of solidarity between African Americans and the Jewish community in America in standing against hatred, bigotry, and injustice. A couple of takeaways and thoughts that I would like to interject into our conversation today is: one, the source of these deep bonds of solidarity; two, the current challenges that we see today that beckon for the reinvigorating of these deep bonds of solidarity; and three, the prospects for the deep bonds between the African American and Jewish communities here in America. So first, as this documentary points out, there is a rich, and Mr. Sharansky referred to this, there's a rich spiritual tradition and a striking historical narrative that the African American community shares with the Jewish community. Both of our communities, and by the way, by saying both of our communities, not to suggest that the two communities and that identification are mutually exclusive, because there is a large and vibrant African Jewish community of color in America and throughout the world. But both of our communities have drawn upon the eternal riches of the fathers and mothers of Jewish tradition found in the Jewish scriptures. We have rallied upon the stories of Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Hezekiah, and Isaiah to usher us triumphantly through the most inhumane and savage of injustices. I believe we have been the targets of this systemic and ever-pervasive toxicity in societies the world over, not because of what is wrong with us, although of course as human beings, we all have our share of self-inflicting imperfections, but quite distinctly because of what is right about us. The elephant in the room of this toxic psychosis that has historically and contemporaneously infected and affected our ever-emergent antagonist is the concealed, warped, and projected complex of those who unleash hatred against others because deep down they have self-hatred. This is why you see the same venom spewed against both of our communities. And this is why in the fight for justice, we can not only fight against the ugly manifestations of bigotry, but we must seek to be agents of the healing power of both justice and love. But we cannot do so by turning a blind eye or ignoring the ailment or true diagnosis of where and what is the infection. Second, these challenges are not only historical challenges, but they are contemporary challenges. The spike in white supremacy and extremism within the United States has indeed been alarming. And we are not just talking about overt racism and anti-Semitism, but festering and evasive bigotries that wield their ugly heads in so many forms, such as implicit bias, conspiracy theory, replacement theology, and the demonization of both the African and Jewish homelands. But let us not be deluded into thinking that this is the product of a single political personality or camp. Although stirred and emboldened by individuals and groups, it is a poison that African Americans and Jews alike know all so well has been with us at the depths of society for generations. While we have seen quite a bit of remobilization in recent years within the present environment of systemic racism and unyielding anti-Semitism, unfortunately, we have seen all too much complacency within our communities when it comes to the plight and struggles of the other. We cannot engage in a self-defeating fight to remain off of the bottom of the barrel of targeted bigotry by stepping on one another and being insensitive to the common struggles of our brothers and sisters in the other community. We cannot be seduced into becoming perpetrators of the very bigotry directed towards one another that we ourselves despise when we are the recipients of such bigotries. We cannot deny the struggles and narratives of one another. There is too much on the line, and we have too much to fight for together to be a blessing in our land and a blessing in the world. I believe, in conclusion, that the African American and Jewish communities have a very unique and powerful calling and destiny to shine light into our world. This light is a light of faith, a light of hope, and a light of love. In the words of the Torah, if we will simply embrace and hearken ourselves in our world to loving our neighbor as ourselves, the hope of humanity will shine like the dawn, and we will enter into a new promising era of peace and goodwill in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ansel. Thanks for your inspiring and wise comments. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. The next speaker is Professor Sunni Ali. Sunni is an associate professor at Northeastern Illinois University, and he's also been on an adjunct professor at Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies as well. He works a lot on music and culture and hip hop, and he was also a presenter, a professor on our Summer Institute. So Sunni, welcome back to ISGAP program. It's great to see you, and thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm extremely honored to be on the panel and just to sit here with wonderful scholars and intellectual activists that have done the work. Yeah, I'm just honored to be here. And you know, here in the United States, we're celebrating Black History Month, and Black History Month in the United States, it celebrates and honors the legacy of African Americans people's gift to humanity and the United States development as an influential nation in world history. Without African Americans' contribution to science, mathematics, technology, agriculture, and other artisanship endeavors, the country would not be as advanced as it exists today. In addition to this, African Americans' resiliency in surviving chattel enslavement, racial oppression, and terrorism speak to the ancient story of the Israelites, who persevered beyond their persecutions to exhibit a magnificent history of overcoming and succeeding beyond racial terror and genocide. This is where Jewish people and African Americans share the same historical legacy, one that often dismiss their intellectual contributions and magnificent forwardness. Our struggles of fighting back and resisting made nations around the world become democratized. Liberatory attainment continues to rest on oppressed people's ability to resist and transform society's immoral and unjust ways. If not for African Americans and Jewish people's direct actions and strategic outcomes, fighting to improve systemic structural inequities and inequalities, where would our world be today? Yet, this same fight exists despite the incredible strides gained. More than ever before, it remains essential for ethnic groups to condemn and fight against white populist nationalism, which remains deadly toward Jews, African Americans, and other indigenous people around the world. This was on full display at the Capitol Rebellion in January. President Trump's MAGA radicals, white nationalists, attacked the US Capitol, killing and injuring police officers. In the process, they advertised anti-Semitic vitriol, celebrated chattel slavery, used racial slurs, and sought to lynch or murder anyone that differed from their political views. Despite this criminal escapade and the arrests made, these same folks have not gone anywhere as they continue to make threats that there will be more harmful actions soon. After all, former President Trump received 74 million ballots in the 2020 presidential election. Like the progressive time frame in the 1890s, and the civil rights era of the 1960s, African Americans and Jewish people bridged their struggles to counter and challenge the Jim Crow era. It remains dire that this same unification emerges to thwart white supremacy notions. The revolutionary work of resistance and change agency is how we celebrate and honor the ancestors that made Black and Jewish history remarkable. In honoring Black history in the United States, we celebrate each other's struggle to continue to work to improve our nations to eliminate racism and anti-Semitism.
It's 18 hours.
Thank you, Sunni. Thank you very much for your intervention, and your perspective is very important. And I think to remind us that this is Black History Month, and the issues of human rights and justice for all citizens continues to be a very serious issue and struggle. So thank you very much for your comment. Next up is Shari Frank. Shari is the former Southeast Area Director of the American Jewish Committee. She's speaking from Atlanta, Georgia. She's been very active in the Jewish community and major Jewish organizations, and also was very active in the civil rights movement and was close to Congressman Lewis. So Shari Frank, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here. Sorry, Shari, you're muted.
Okay. Hi. Hi, everyone. And I'm honored and thrilled to be with you. My story is really a story of the last 40 years of activism, from driving people to the polls when Andy Young ran for Congress to working with the American Jewish Committee for 25 years. And in 1982, we created an Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition that today is still alive and well. And what I really want to do is share some of the things that we did through the coalition that really share what happens when Blacks and Jews sit at the table and talk to one another, learn about each other's struggles, and with a common bond, really speak out on them. So I want to share many of them, and it's so exciting to see Natan Sharansky, because so much of what our work really did deal with Soviet Jews. But just for instance, we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge with Congressman John Lewis in 1984. And John stood with us. We at Coretta Scott King's suggestion, every 5 years, we reenacted the March on Washington, and Jews and Blacks and folks of all religions and races did that. But when it was time to march for Soviet Jewry for the Freedom March, we marched with John Lewis, Congressman Lewis of blessed memory. And not only did he speak at the march, but he brought words from Coretta Scott King, who was unable to do that. And one of my favorite stories, I told Mrs. King when we were trying to plan a date for the next Black Jewish Coalition meeting that particular date wouldn't work for me. I was going to Russia, to the Soviet Union, to meet with refuseniks. And she said, Shari, you have to stop by my office before you leave. And I did. And she gave me 3 books that she signed. And it was about her struggles, continuing the work of Dr. King after he died. And she said, I want you to give it to 3 women whose husbands are in prison who are still continuing their work. And I gave it to a woman in Moscow, in Riga, and someone in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Each of them knew the struggles of Dr. King and was so happy to see that. And Natan, I don't know whether you remember, but I grew up a very close friend of Stuart Eisenstadt, the ambassador. And when you spoke in Atlanta at the Eisenstadt lecture, Stu said, you know, Natan would really like to go to the King Center to hear Dr. King's words. And I called Marty King, and we sat in a small office with, with the monitor and Dr. King's words. And I remember just with goosebumps when you, Sharansky, heard the words of Dr. King and started speaking out, that you shared that same feeling of, you can lock us up, but you can't lock up our spirit for survival and freedom. And Congressman Lewis was one of my closest friends. He called me his sister. I called him my brother. But he went with the freshman group to Russia, and he was told not to raise the issue of Soviet Jewry. And on the last night in the Kremlin, he quoted from Dr. King's speech with why we can't, the letters from the Birmingham jail of why we can't wait. When we think about anti-Semitism, the Jewish community was so troubled by the horrible words of Minister Louis Farrakhan. John Lewis did not march in the Million Man March because of the anti-Semitism. And Mrs. King, as soon as Farrakhan said things like Jews are a gut of religion and Israel's an outlaw state, Mrs. King joined me and others at a press conference denouncing those words. So we really, and I can remember we also did press conferences speaking out when President Reagan was going to a Bitburg, to a cemetery where Nazis were. We worked for a posthumous pardon for Leo Frank, a man who was hung. We worked for the Martin Luther King birthday bill. I traveled with Blacks to Israel. We created a Black Jewish Sisters group, and we went on a trip to Harlem and on a trip to the Holocaust Museum to just share and know each other's histories. So that was the past, but even today, there is a national movement that is a coalition of the Urban League and the American Jewish Committee, where in every city that they have young professionals groups, they're working together. The American Jewish Committee helped create just a year or two ago the Black Jewish Congressional Caucus. And just to be politically bragging, we're so proud in Georgia that our two senators, Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff, a Black and a Jew, who really probably would not have won if each of them weren't building on each other's support and campaigned together. And through that campaign really lifted up the Black Jewish history. So I'll end with there, but just to say, this film opened at our film festival in Atlanta to almost an overcrowded 1,000 people cheering, clapping when people from Atlanta were on the film, particularly Congressman Lewis, who we just missed so much today. But the alliance is well and strong in Atlanta because we continue to find new ways. And just one final note, one of the press releases I wrote when I was at the American Jewish Committee with the head of the NAACP was a press release celebrating that Natan Sharansky were supposed to be released on the same day. And we know that press release is still in our files because the two releases happened years apart. But struggles of one community really are struggles of another community if we do as the last speaker spoke and really bring forth hope, faith, and love. And that's what we've done in Atlanta.
So thank you, Shari, Frank. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and experiences. And it's really appreciated. You have a very important understanding of history and understanding of the contemporary challenges. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Next, the final speaker, last but not least, Reverend Dr. Carlton Long. Carlton is the CEO of Lawrence Long and Company, an educational consulting company, as I explained earlier. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where we met originally just a couple of years ago. He was a professor at Columbia University, taught all over the world. He is our director of pedagogy at our Summer Institute. He helps scholars develop curriculum on issues of contemporary anti-Semitism. Carlton graduated not only from Oxford, but Morehouse College, where he was at the School of Divinity. So Carlton, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here. And you're muted, Carlton. Sorry, okay.
When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. And tell, oh proud Pharaoh, to let my people go. That's our song, and that's your song. So I want to thank you, Charles, and ISGAP, Ira, and all our friends here for this wonderful opportunity to celebrate who we are, who we've been, how we have struggled, how we have partnered, and who we may become. It's an honor to return with my friends here at ISGAP, to share the stage with the greatly esteemed Natan Sharansky, and also to be with all my other wonderful, brilliant friends, old and new, from ISGAP. My story will be a short story because I know that we have questions and conversations to have, but I would just like to talk about story just for a minute, because it seems to me that in this very peculiar moment in which we are all living as human rights activists, it seems that, you know, we're fighting kind of a politics of gaslighting. We have to deal with issues of truth and what is our truth and what is our story. I mean, we know even from the Jewish story, the horrors of the Holocaust deniers, this way of wounding and re-wounding a people. We know in the United States, what we're witnessing as well, the denial of truth at a level that is staggering and might remind people such as our esteemed Natan Sharansky about the disinformation campaigns that human rights activists have long fought against. So I think my contribution, I hope today, will just be the elevation of that one word, truth, and say, how can we engage and continue to engage the truth of our stories, the truth of our partnership, the truth of our promise, and to fight against those who would tell us that we are different from who we are, that our partnership does not exist, that our commonalities as Blacks and Jews are fewer than they are, when in fact our struggles have been so enormously intertwined and so profoundly mirror one another. And for that, I also thank Shari Rogers for her brilliant film, which really reminds us. And I love the way that she said, you know, it's not about a trip down memory lane or about nostalgia, but rather to remind us of a commitment and of a partnership and of a promise for brotherhood, sisterhood, humanity, and as Levinas has wisely told us, the possibilities of seeing humanity reflected in the eyes of the other. So just briefly, a few stories that I think might help us to continue in our conversations. And I don't really like the idea of stories because, you know, when I was a kid, you would grow up, you said story, that could also sound like it was a euphemism for a lie. So I'm saying, like, I'm talking about our truths. What are our truths? What are our narratives? And one of the things that's been fascinating to me has been just this return to almost the idea of autoethnography. Like, how does my own life reflect into the broader story of my people? How does my journey also tell a broader story? How am I situated within a broader story, and what wisdom, you know, can we gain from that? I can just say that for me, you know, I take great pride in the fact that, you know, I was born in the month and the year that the sit-in movement started. The sit-in started in May of 1961. And there you had Blacks and Jews, Catholics, whites, young people of all stripes going down to make sure that the civil rights movement could be advanced and that voter participation could occur and that rights could be made real in the United States. And that's just part of my own journey. And then I think about, even as I progress coming out of Gary, Indiana, and being loved and supported by my family and my education, and going to a place like Columbia University, where one of my greatest professors was a Jewish man named Harry Wachtel. And I took his course as law and social change because I was interested in law and social change. But I had no idea when I enrolled in his class what a great man he was. And I sat there and he casually just began to tell us about his client, Martin, how he had worked with Martin Luther King and guided him in the civil rights movement in terms of providing partnership, brotherhood. And in fact, it was Wachtell who encouraged King to go ahead and on April 4th, 1967, to go ahead and give that speech at Riverside Church to condemn what was going on in an international context, like the militarism of the United States, exactly a year before the death, before the murder of Martin Luther King on April 4th of 68. And that was my professor who said, look, let's go ahead and do that. Go ahead and do that. It's time. It's time. The time is now. So when I just look into my own story, I see the beginnings of the civil rights movement. When I look into my young adulthood, I see the purpose of the civil rights movement and brotherhood and humanity. When I look into my graduate study, I see my friend Charles Small, who went to classes with me at Oxford for years and years as we debated the tough issues of the time, things that we thought were difficult. And lo and behold, we're in a completely more challenging world, more perilous world today. And the call for brotherhood, sisterhood, partnership, renewal between Blacks and Jews is more fiercely needed than ever before. So I just want to remind us all of our own stories and invite us all to remember one lesson I got from another Black preacher, William Barber in North Carolina, who was on a stage there about 5 or 6 years ago on a Martin Luther King Day. And he shared the stage with other dignitaries, and you can imagine they didn't all share the same political outlook at all. In fact, he was with some rather reactionary white politicians on the stage. And I was wondering how he was going to deal with things when it was time for him to speak. And he came up and he said, well, yes, Martin Luther King, he said, but not all this superficial stuff of, mountaintop and, the things, and that, a colorblind world only, but that King was aware of color and poverty and pain and hatred. And he was much more radical than he is sanitized to be. So Barber talked about all these things, and then he did something quite remarkable, and I loved him for it. He said, how many people here, he said, it's not just about who King was, but it's about who he is and what his work is, what it continues to be. So let me ask you, how many of you are in favor of, the Affordable Care Act? How many of you are in favor of an increase in minimum wage? How many of you are interested in the renewal of the voting rights, reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act? If you are in favor of these three things, stand up on your feet. And you saw, and many people stood, and many people on the dais with Barber did not. And he knew that they would not. And he turned to one of the governors and said, oh, Governor, you're not standing. Governor, you're not standing. Some of your dignitaries up here, y'all not standing. Then he looked out to the audience and said, see, I'm too old to play. I didn't come here to play. He said, I'm too old to play. And I think we're all too old to play. And I think that we have to deal with the truth. And as an educator, as a pedagogue, I encourage us to center truth, whatever that is, whether you have some Cartesian view or some other view of objectivity. Let's have a real conversation about what is real and what is true. And let's have that in the classroom. And let's have that in our lives, because it's more desperately needed now, not just in Black History Month, and not just between Blacks and Jews, but between all of us as God's children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlton. Thanks for your wisdom and your insights. Profound, as always. Thank you. So we have a bit of time for Q&A. I offered Rabbi Hillel Lavri Israeli, who's calling in from Canada, to have the first question. So you're welcome. And okay, go ahead. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I want to thank especially Dr. Long for the singing of Let My People Go. Beautifully done and very touching, especially as you know, it's exactly a month before Passover now. So in a month we'll be celebrating that and singing that ourselves around our seders and remembering all those people who are who have experienced slavery or who are experiencing slavery and racism and oppression, and thinking about our part in the world in combating that together with everyone else. So thank you for the music. Distinguished hosts and panelists, guests and friends, my name is Rabbi Hillel Lavri Israeli, and I'm proud to be the rabbi of Beth Jacob Synagogue in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. It was my predecessor here, Rabbi Eugene Weiner, in 1965, who led a group of clergy from different religions to Selma to march with Dr. King. And it's been written about in the news. In fact, I saw his picture in the film that you're making. So Rabbi, that you made. Rabbi Weiner is there as well. In my work as a rabbi, I work hard to try to fight all forms of racism and prejudice and try to educate all to realize that hate for one is hate for all. My synagogue was defaced a little over a year ago with graffitied swastikas and the words "No Jews." And a few months ago, a city councilor here in Hamilton received anti-Black hate messages in her voicemail, and I quickly mobilized our Jewish community to get together to show our support and solidarity. I'd also just like to point out that we are celebrating Black History Month here in Hamilton as well, and my son's Jewish school is celebrating it by dedicating its lessons to various Black thinkers, inventors, scientists, artists, authors, etc. So it's not just in the States. But now my question, because you asked me to ask a question. My question is, a lot is the same, but a lot has changed in the past 70 years. It may feel to some that back then the hate manifested itself quite similarly. We saw in the film businesses that wouldn't permit Jews or Blacks to enter, for instance. Now the hate exists toward us both, but it often manifests itself in different ways. Just one example, we don't usually see Jews being murdered by police officers, but we do see Black people being murdered by police officers. On the other hand, when our synagogues are under threat, we generally do turn to the police to help us. It's not completely true that the police are our friends either, because there's a huge amount of white supremacy in the police forces throughout North America. Anyway, the point is, the hate can look very different now. Do we need to somehow adapt our education methods to educate people, and especially the youth going forward, to look beyond the surface and to see that this still is the very same hate directed at both of us, and that really the only way for both of us is to work together and support each other? Thank you.
So thank you for your question. Who from the panel would like to answer? Shari? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I unfortunately have to sign off. So in 30 seconds, let me just say, I think we demonstrate with one another that we have to speak out when the other is offended. In the South, there was a time not too distant future where Black churches were burned, and in the American Jewish Committee and in Atlanta particularly, we did hands-on and rebuilt a church and paid for students at Atlanta University to go down to South Georgia to help build a church. And when the synagogue in Pittsburgh was under attack and fellow Jews were killed, the first calls we got of sympathy were from Black ministers in Atlanta. So I think when you create dialogue and create coalitions and create relationships, just like in a family, when one's hurting, the other hurts, and we reach out to one another, and we need to do more of that. And please forgive me, I'm leading a session and people are signing on for the next one, but it was an honor to be with you all, and particularly to see Sharansky. My heart is full. And please forgive me for signing off.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Would anybody else from the panel like to respond to the question?
Well, I do believe that it is very important for us to address the current contemporary manifestations of racism and anti-Semitism. I really appreciated the story that Dr. Long shared of Reverend Barber, who by the way, is a graduate of my institution, North Carolina Central University. We're very proud of all of the work that he is doing. But I think it exemplifies the fact that the injustice that is distant is much easier to stand against than the injustice that is before us, and that is inconvenient in some ways to take on. And so to this point, Rabbi Hillel, I really appreciate you sharing that, is that we have to be willing sometimes to inconvenience ourselves, to stand against the issues that are before us and the contemporary manifestations of racism and anti-Semitism. And we need to be proactive, intentional, and strategic in educating the public about these contemporary issues. So I think it is a very important thing that we need to take head on. And I appreciate you raising that point.
Thank you, Ansel. Anybody else on the panel? Sonia, I think you're speaking, but you're muted.
Sorry about that, Doc.
Oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
I'd like to add something to that as well. What Ansel was talking about, it really starts in the schoolhouses too, in terms of developing the sorts of curriculum, pedagogy, and alliance systems that can be had among the youth. So one of the schools that I work with that I have a contract, there's a Black history, was a Black studies group, there's a Jewish studies group. And so creating an alliance between the two and having conversations about not only race, anti-Semitism, but more importantly, demanding that, and when I say demanding, but emphasizing that there has to be project-based assessments and assignments done at the collegiate level, high school level, that bridge these historic groups together so that people can see that they have more in common than differences.
Thank you, Sunni. Anybody else?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I have to,
Shari, then Carlton.
a couple things. When I was interviewing the students, the college students from the Goodman Foundation, as you saw in the film, his brother was murdered for trying to help Blacks to vote. So he created a foundation that's across college campuses in the United States. But what's really important is sometimes, until you really get together, you don't know sometimes what we sometimes call racism or anti-Semitism. So for instance, the rap songs came up, and sometimes, I don't know, one of the rap songs, I don't remember who it was, and they said something about the Jewish people like owning stores or owning everything. And then said, well, we thought that was like, we thought that was cool, like it was a compliment, something like that. But it was like the Jewish community that could communicate that, how that felt as anti-Semitic, and then relate it back to, certain other times in Nazi Germany, or when other people used, when they group a whole people under that, and how that can be a negative. Dr. Michael Dyson went into it, we couldn't include everything into the film, but he was very clear about how racism can be, that other people don't know when something is racist. So the point is that we really have to be, and I hope our film showed this, proximate to each other. We have to get together more often. We have to have conversations. We have to have films and curriculum that can unpack this. And this is just the beginning. That's basically, what I wanted to say. And the last thing I just wanted to say is, like, Reverend Warnock, who's now Senator Warnock, and Rabbi Berg, they're working together on very important legislation to fight white supremacy. So, there's so much we can do together, but we really need to get connected so we can unpack all this.
Thanks, Shari. Carlton?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I really just want to piggyback on what's been said before. I think a lot can be done in terms of pedagogy. and, reminding people that, it's really important to study. It's not just enough to feel. It's not always just enough even to share our own stories, but to study our own stories, to unpack our own autoethnographies, and to explore them, to analyze them in the context of theory, so that we can get perhaps more interesting conversations going. And, I'm going to play around again with this whole idea of truth again. And I know Natan will appreciate, when I took my little Russian class and was calling myself Koshta, one of the interesting things was that the newspaper was called Pravda, but that Pravda meant truth. And so that's really interesting as a newspaper name for a lot of reasons, when we deal with disinformation and all sorts of things. But again, to center the idea, I want schools to explore the idea of truth, to make that central. What does that mean? How can we be objective about what is going on? What is going on? What is going on in our lives? What's going on in our community? We can have different takes on it. It can be like the man feeling the elephant, one person feeling the tusk, the other one feeling the tail, another feeling the side, and all having some grasp of this from an epistemological point of view. But let's unpack it. My God, we certainly need it today.
Thanks, Carlton. I think I saw that in a tweet. No, I'm kidding. The challenge,
Oh, yes, it's out there. It is. It's a classic. It's a classic.
Social media, yeah.
No, it's a classic.
Very important. Thank you. So there's a good question from Rabbi Bob Kaplan. Ira, are you able to open his microphone so you can ask the question, or I can read it? Is Rabbi Kaplan available?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thanks for
I'm
joining us.
sorry. The question is, can the panel begin to address the issue of inner city conflict between Blacks and Jews? Because often the conflict has different foundations, different issues. I agree with you. The proximate issue, people live literally proximate, but are not proximate with each other. However, sometimes we utilize paradigms that don't necessarily fit the kinds of issues that are facing these communities that are, and I'll use the word thoughtfully, sharing or not sharing the resources and the neighborhoods that they live in.
Hey, Rabbi Kaplan, where are you calling in from? You're muted again. But
Can you
Rabbi
hear me?
Kaplan,
Yeah.
where are you calling from?
Yeah, I'm the director of the Center for Community Leadership at the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, and have been involved. I've been there for 27 years and began my career shortly after the events in Crown Heights of the summer of 1991, which, depending upon whose lens you look through, was either a riot, a pogrom, or a social uprising.
Okay, thank you. Who on the panel would like to address this important issue? Professor Brown? Okay.
Well, I'll just say that part of the work that we did a few years ago with Dr. Long at ISGAP over the summer in developing a curriculum for our college programs has been very helpful, because one of the speakers said, and it was Shari, just said, we have to unpack this. One of the challenges I find is that whenever we have conversations about the Jewish struggle and how it aligns to the Black struggle, is that too often African Americans see our Jewish brothers and sisters as white, in America, in the American context. And I always have to kind of go over that, Jewish people are very diverse all over the world, right? And they make up different ethnic groups. And that always shocks them, because they have been so inundated and conditioned with the fact that Jews are the elite white people in this country. And even in the conversations with young people at the high school, when the clubs do get together, some of our Jewish brothers and sisters consider themselves white. And there's even a debate among them about that. So I think deconstructing whiteness is critical as a first step.
Thank you, Sunni. And actually, so apropos of this, I'll just make a quick comment. There's an excellent article. I'll try and post it in the chat for everybody. Tudor Parfit, who's a professor at SOAS in the University of London and also in Florida, wrote an excellent piece on race and Jewish identity. He just published it about a week ago, and I'll try and find it and post it. But I find it staggering how Jews were murdered for not being white, and now we're being put in a position of whiteness, usually for antagonistic reasons. So the fluidity and social construction of race and how it's used or misused, for which purposes. And I think one of the key elements, in racism and anti-Semitism and sexism and other forms of hatred is the ability of people to define themselves. Once you lose the power to define yourselves, you're having serious issues and problems. And I think for too long, Jews and African Americans, we've been defined by the other. We're constantly being defined by the other. And I think that's where the problems begin. We have to have the ability to assert our identity with a sense of pride. And Natan works on this in a very eloquent and an important manner. And I think it's a crucial issue in fighting all forms of discrimination. So I'll try and post this very important article by Professor Parfit. And I think Ira already beat me to it. If you look in the chat, it's a very important article. And I think this is also unique to the United States because in a sense, race is so important and fixed in American society. And I think it's unique. Racism exists in other parts of the world and anti-Semitism exists, but the racialization of identity is so structured into American society. And I think there's a uniqueness to it. It's not that these issues don't exist in other parts of the world, but there's something unique and deep in American society. Anybody else? Ansel? Yeah. Ansel, you wanted to say something or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Charles, that's a very important point that you raise. The idea of race and privilege in America, I believe, is a factor that really, truly instigates a lot of the tension between the Black and Jewish community, particularly in the inner city. And I think it's very important, as you know, Charles, that we have been deeply impacted and affected by this very simplistic characterization of us as Black, white, really white and other, essentially, is what it is. And I think that has aggravated the tensions between us. And I believe we have to have conversation amongst ourselves. We have to re-engage one another. And in that re-engagement, in that dialogue and discourse with one another, meaning the Black and Jewish community, we cannot allow our own pain to be so drastic and traumatic that we become dull and insensitized to the pain of the other, the pain of our brother and sister who is also experiencing a very comparable and parallel pain. And maybe the reality is that there have been different experiences in America. That is the truth between the Black and Jewish community. Now, if you're talking about the European Jewish experience, there's a lot stronger parallels. But because we don't have those conversations and our pain is so deep and we are so impacted by our unfortunate legacies of oppression, demonization, alienation, racism, anti-Semitism, we oftentimes do not come to the table listening to one another. Going back to what I noted in my introductory remarks, if we will truly love our neighbor as ourselves, then we will hear one another and we will feel the pain and we will fight for one another in a way that I believe, again, can really be transformative, both within our communities and in our societies. But we have to listen to one another and feel the pain of one another and understand one another. And I think a part of that, as you mentioned, Charles, will be us setting aside the identities, the oversimplified identities that have been imposed upon both of our communities here in America.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Charles, I will jump in as well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, I agree very much. I think, Charles, with what you were just saying as well about the sometimes maybe the uniqueness of the way that the race function has worked out in the United States. The kind of what some writers have said is like the sui generis kind of aspect of it, that it's like there from the very beginning, and then it takes root in a very, very peculiar way for a host of reasons, which ride, of course, upon the transatlantic slave trade, but then spirals off into lots of different directions as new peoples are integrated into the culture or not, or absorbed or not into the culture, and then kind of it's almost like we're all fighting this, the new strands of a virus, right? With COVID-19, it's like there's a reification that occurs with this kind of hatred, and it morphs and becomes more difficult sometimes to detect based on the environment that it's been operating in. A couple of things that might be helpful in the conversations, Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which kind of gets at that point that, hey, it's not just a fixed function, which we know, but it's also something that's been really profound and multi-layered and reified. Also, one of the graduates from ISGAP, Mark Dollinger, talking about Black power and Jewish politics, reinventing the alliance in the 1960s. And there are ways to reinvent, ways to recapture, ways to rebuild, ways to restore, and to remind ourselves again of our very similar histories and alliances and common cause. How do we make common cause for the sake of humanity? And a lot of it, again, is, I think, just science and really wrestling with what is true. Is what is true, what is real.
Yeah, I just want to add that that it was really striking for me when I interviewed Congressman John Lewis. One of his most profound statements, I included it at the end of the film. He said, "We are all living in fear." But he has to imagine if Dr. Martin Luther King were alive today and Rabbi Joshua Heschel, they would be pulling together for those generations yet unborn. And just like Natan Sharansky and Judge Damon Keith pulled together, obviously it's the symbolism, because these people knew Heschel, who had 3 sisters murdered in Nazi Germany and a mother, Rabbi Martin Luther King, who had lynchings and the black slavery and murders. They were able to fill up their cup, I'm repeating myself, but not with despair, with hope. With Dr. Martin Luther King said he was an extremist. What was he an extremist of? Love, seeing the value of each human being as an individual. And it kind of goes back to the foundation of our Exodus story. As a Jew, the idea is that each person is born in the image of God, completely individualistic, so that the nuance of each individual has to be lifted up as well. How we each are formed with completely separate eyes, nose, mouth, ears, color, but we each are individualistic, and to lift that up. And as the Purim story comes up now, actually, I think today or tomorrow, the idea is that a whole people were devalued. Not only was Moses, in a sense, the first social justice protester, but then they said all of the Jews there's no value to them. So isn't it, it's imperative that the Jewish people have to understand that each person has value. And if you do not see the value in each individual other, then you are not being true. Talk about truth to truth. That's it.
Well said, Shari. Thank you. Thanks. So, Natan, would you like to comment? I'll bring you back to the conversation.
No, what the fact that what just now Shari said that that's what I tried to say in my remarks about that when Martin Luther King was saying that his dream is rooted in American dream, was speaking exactly about it, that every person has the same human rights, the same right to pursue for happiness. And unfortunately, well, I was living in the Soviet Union where critical class theory, as you today will say, class struggle, class origin, that would define if the person is right or wrong. If he belongs to the proletarian, he's always right. If he belongs to a bourgeois, he's always wrong. And that defined everything. Today we have this critical race theory that, again, oppressed is against oppressed. You are always right or you are always wrong. And we really, I think, the base of our cooperation between human rights activists, Jewish human rights activists, and among Black Americans, that's exactly this, that we are all equals, and we cannot treat people as those who belong to the oppressors or to the oppressed, and that's that what defines whether people are right or wrong. And unfortunately, very often it is lost today, and then really we cannot, it's very difficult to find common language.
So Natan, thank you. Thank you. So I think on that note, we went quite a bit over time, and I know there's a lot more to discuss, but we'll end it there. Thank you everybody for attending. Pardon me?
Can I say one thing?
Of course, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. I did just want to end, I think in the context of Purim, in the book of Esther, chapter 4 rather, verse 4, it says, "For if you remain completely silent, at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish." And I think this is very important for us to note that if we do not stand not only for our own, but for the other, not only will deliverance arise from another place, but we in our household will perish, that we must stand for the Jewish community, and the Jewish community must stand for the African-American community. And I think Purim is a great context to keep this in mind. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you for your wisdom, Professor Brown. Thank you. So it's a positive way to end, and I think that's a very powerful message. We really need to always stand up, and we're living in a time.
And thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles, for convening this.
Thank you for being here. And just to end, democracy is something that always needs to be renewed. We always have to stand up. So
thank you.
To expand it. So thank you everybody for being here. The panel was brilliant, and thank you for your time and your insights and your contribution. Good to see everybody. There's a lot of familiar faces online, and thank you. Stay well and safe.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.